With last month's release of the various Game Boy games onto the Switch, I decided to play through all the ones currently available and let you know if any of them are actually worth playing. Some of them have aged better than others. I should add that every game I talk about is obviously my subjective opinion, and some of them you may even have some nostalgia for. The first game we'll be looking at is Link's Awakening. The story starts with Link getting caught up in a storm and finding himself on Koholint Island, or at least that's how I think it's supposed to be pronounced. After waking up inside a villager's house, or more specifically Marin's house, Link collects his sword and shield. He's then tasked with collecting 8 magical instruments, which will allow him to awaken the Windfish and leave the island. The game plays like most 2D Zelda games, with Link exploring an overworld and dungeons, while collecting items to help him progress along the way. What separates this game from some of the other entries in the franchise are its strange characters, like a man who's been transformed into a raccoon, as well as the appearance of other Nintendo characters, like Yoshi and the Chain Chomps. The most unique aspect of the game was the fact that Zelda nor Ganon appeared in the game, which was unheard of at the time for a Zelda game. The dungeons play out like most in the series, with new pieces of equipment being hidden inside each dungeon, like Rock's Feather, allowing Link to jump, with dungeons also including puzzles, often relating to the new item, with a mini-boss and boss thrown in for good measure. Overall, I would highly recommend this game to anyone who has an interest in Zelda games, as this is a solid entry in the franchise. If you're not, I would still recommend the game, as its simple nature makes it an easy gateway into the series. Tetris is a game that I have next to no skill in, and despite the game looking easy, in reality it's fairly difficult, or I should say easy to learn, hard to master. This classic version of the game also comes with a multiplayer mode, which seems to be a common feature with these Game Boy games that have recently been released onto the Switch. And aside from a few music options and difficulty settings, that's all there is to this version. Personally, I wouldn't recommend this version of Tetris to someone unless they have a personal attachment to this iteration. Instead, I would recommend a newer Tetris game like Tetris 99 or Puyo Puyo Tetris, or Tetris Effect, as they all provide the game of Tetris but with added features. Being the first Kirby game, Dreamland is quite different from its successors. At first I was confused when booting up the game, as Kirby didn't seem to gain any abilities from sucking up enemies. To my surprise, the very first Kirby game didn't feature Kirby's power stealing abilities. The game, however, does feature the same lovable pink ball, as well as the classic enemies he torments. And with a handful of stages and bosses, this game took me around half an hour to complete, which makes sense, as the game didn't have a save feature when first released. Although slightly dull with the lack of real power-ups, the game was quite fun and forgiving in terms of difficulty. With it being so short, there isn't really any reason not to give it a go. From playing this game, I think it's fair to say that it might be a bit of a Marmite game. You either hate it or love it. However, there's no doubt that the game may have aged somewhat poorly. The game follows our protagonist, Edward Carnby, a private investigator who finds out his friend, Charles, has been murdered. So he does what anyone else would do and flies to an island called Shadow Island to uncover the mystery. The game involves you fighting creatures while solving various puzzles by interacting with the environment and using items you pick up along the way. And while the graphical style is ambitious, it doesn't really hold up, nor do the bright flashes of white light after entering a new area. While an interesting game, I stopped playing early on before it gave me a headache. I would recommend this game if you have an existing love for it, or an interest in the genre of horror games. After the events of the first Mario Land game, Mario returns to his castle on Mario Island. We can only assume that housing on Mario Island must be incredibly cheap, since he shares a house with his brother in the Mushroom Kingdom. After finding out that Wario has taken over, Mario must collect 6 golden coins and defeat Wario. The game plays like any other 2D Mario game, the only difference being the visuals for existing power-ups, a bunny/carrot power for Mario, and some unique and unusual enemies for Mario to fight, like ants, jack-in-the-boxes, and toads, the jumpy kind anyway. The game is split into 6 sections with multiple levels and a boss at the end of each section. With the game being around 30 years old now, it obviously can't compare to newer Mario titles. However, its unique elements allow it to stand out compared to its newer counterparts. I'd say that if you're a fan of Mario games, then you should give it a go. If you've never played a 2D Mario game before, maybe its 2 difficulty options might help you out. But I wouldn't say you're missing out on anything life-changing by not playing the game. Metroid 2 follows the story of Samus as she travels to another planet with the mission of eliminating the Metroids that inhabit the planet, which are the strange-looking jellyfish things. The game plays in a similar way to most Metroidvania games, which makes sense, as it's quite literally in the name. The gameplay involves Samus running and jumping her way through the world while shooting various enemies, and of course, eliminating the Metroids. Like the rest of the series, the game features the ability to upgrade and acquire new abilities for Samus to allow for more exploration. One thing you do want to avoid, however, is getting low on health, as you'll be constantly greeted by a beeping sound. I would recommend this game to any fan of the series, but if it's your first time, the game may get a little confusing, since there isn't an in-game map, which is why I would recommend any of the newer Metroid games. After a plane crash, Wario enters a magic music box. Stuck in said box, he must find 5 magic music boxes within the music box to escape. The game involves Wario travelling through stages looking to collect treasure, new abilities, and of course the music boxes. Uniquely, Wario isn't damaged by enemy attacks, and in fact can use these to unlock areas. This includes, but is not limited to, being set on fire, being turned into a zombie, becoming fat, and being invisible. The game also features a day and night cycle, changing the stages and the creatures that occupy the stages. This, along with the new abilities that Wario can learn, allows you to replay stages and unlock areas within the level later on. I personally enjoyed the game as I felt it differentiated itself from other Nintendo platformers and provided a unique experience while being relatively easy thanks to the fact that you can't really die. Gargoyle Quest was probably my least favourite of the games released. The game plays like any other platformer, but with you having the ability to hover/glide for a short period of time, cling onto walls, and as well as fire projectiles to defeat other creatures. The game sadly is still in black and white, as it isn't a Game Boy Color game, or a game that was given colour by the built-in colour thing from the Game Boy, unlike Kirby's Dream Land and Metroid 2. The game feels kind of boring while also being slightly frustrating. Overall, I'd say don't bother with this game, unless it has some form of sentimental value to you. Game & Watch Gallery 3 is a collection of games rather than a game itself, or rather, a collection of mini-games that can be played in a classic mode or a modern mode, which changes the gameplay, while also using updated visuals and Mario characters instead. I would personally recommend using the modern versions, as the classic mode is often slower and less visually appealing. Altogether, the game has 5 separate games within it, with more being unlocked later on. Sadly, the game hasn't aged particularly well, with it being quite boring and repetitive compared to most modern games. But maybe you have fond memories of this game. And now we're finally onto the Game Boy Advance games. And I thought we'd start with Minish Cap. The game was released towards the end of the Game Boy Advance's lifespan, meaning it often doesn't get the recognition it deserves. Vaati, the game's main antagonist, turns Zelda to stone and opens a bound chest, which is more or less a Pandora's box. Link, despite being hatless, starts his journey to save the world. Early on, however, he meets Eslo, a talking hat, which grants him the power to shrink himself to the size of a Minish, which are small, mouse, human-looking elf things. The game also features some of the more unusual items in the Zelda series, like the Gust Jar, which allows you to suck things up, as well as blow things out, allowing you to travel across lily pads and attack various enemies. Personally, this is potentially my favourite 2D Zelda game, so I'd have to recommend you play it. WarioWare Mega Micro Games, or Minigame Mania, is the first game in the WarioWare franchise. The game starts off with another one of Wario's money-making schemes, and contacts his friends to create a video game. From then on, you have to play through the minigames. You have 4 lives and must complete a set amount of minigames until you reach the boss stage, which is essentially a longer minigame. After that, you'll unlock another character, and the process repeats. Each character has their own set of games, some focusing on sport, video games, and everyday life, with some being more questionable than others. In between the minigames, there are wacky cutscenes showing the everyday life of Wario's friends. The game gets progressively harder as the pace of the game increases the further you go, which creates a sense of urgency and panic, but always ensures the game remains interesting. WarioWare Micro Minigames is an easy game to understand and learn, and arguably the best game on this list, therefore I would recommend the game to anyone. Now I'd like to imagine most of you are like me and have never heard of this game. You play as a bird with some form of helicopter who must set out to rescue his brothers and sisters. The hare gives you some advice and guidance on flying, and you go off. The game focuses on travelling through maze-like stages while trying to avoid touching the edges of the stage with your propeller blades. The stages vary from fields, the sea, jungles and cakes. While the gameplay is basic, the environment changes with each inclusion, like springs and so on. In terms of actual gameplay, the game can be super satisfying when you schmoove, and equally irritating when you mess up. The game is much like the WarioWare game before, as it's incredibly easy to get into, and for that reason I would recommend giving the game a go. Super Mario Advance 4, Super Mario Bros. 3 is not only a mouthful, but a game for the Game Boy Advance, which is a remake of Mario Bros. 3. The game also includes the first Mario Bros. Game, but we'll cover that later. The game features an overworld along with multiple worlds. The game obviously plays like every other 2D Mario game, with Mario running and jumping on or over obstacles. The controls are solid and the visuals still hold up well. There's also mini bosses in the fortresses, but maybe after playing Mario Maker you're tired of Boom Boom. The other game, as mentioned before, is Mario Bros, in which Mario must defeat all the enemies to move on to the next stage. With the game being a remake of Mario Bros 3, I'm sure many of you are already playing it. For anyone looking for a solid Mario experience, I couldn't recommend it more. Before I start talking about Mario Super Circuit, why haven't you subscribed yet? Mario's disappointed in you. Either that, or he's about to get out his car and beat you up. Anyway, the player has a choice of 8 characters to play as, with most of them having different stats. The game also features 20 new tracks, as well as 20 old tracks from Super Mario Kart, which can be unlocked later on. There's also 3 CC options, 50cc, 100 and 150, as well as a multiplayer and battle mode. While there's nothing wrong with the game, the later iterations of the game are an improvement. But then again, nostalgia isn't a bad thing. But otherwise, you might as well play the newer versions. Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga is the first game in the Mario & Luigi set of games. The plot entails Peach's voice being stolen by a witch named Cackletta from the Bean Bean Kingdom, with Mario and Luigi travelling through the Mushroom Kingdom and Bean Bean Kingdom to retrieve it, as well as saving the world from the evil Cackletta. Like all other Mario RPG games, it's full of funny moments and humorous characters. The game features turn-based combat and allows the player to perform action commands to increase the damage they deal, as well as to avoid enemy attacks. The brothers can also use bro attacks using bro points to perform devastating attacks on both old and new Mario enemies. The game is ideal for fans of the other Mario and Luigi games, as well as the Paper Mario game fans. Even if you aren't, I would recommend this game to any Mario fan or fans of turn-based combat games. And they're all the Game Boy games that are currently released for the Switch. I apologise if you thought I was too harsh on some of the games. Maybe some of them are your favourite games of all time. If any of them are, please let me know in the comments below. And if you aren't already, are you planning to play any of these games in the future? Or maybe you're waiting for some of the other releases that should come at some point in the future, I suppose. Thanks for watching.